Believe me, Naomi, I loved you. I never married you just to use you.
Naomi Carter stared at the husband she had trusted from a narrow recovery cot, trying to understand why he was begging her to believe his love had been real. Pain burned beneath a heavy dressing along her side, and every movement told her that something inside her body had been changed without permission. There was no hospital name on the wall, no admissions bracelet on her wrist, and no legitimate medical record explaining how she had arrived there. One kidney was already gone, and somewhere else in Seoul, Min-jae's younger sister was waking from a transplant that had saved her life. The most unbearable question was not whether the Kang family had used Naomi. It was how much the man who married her had known before she closed her eyes. How did a forensic accountant from Atlanta end up on an underground operating table after trusting the one person who promised to protect her? Stay with Naomi's story, because the answer begins long before that hidden room, and every tender moment becomes more painful once the truth is finally visible. If this story already has your attention, settle in, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. We bring you powerful long-form stories about love, betrayal, dignity, survival, family, and second chances every week. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today, whether it is your city, state, or country. Now, let us go back 6 months, to a humid Tuesday morning in Mexico City, when Naomi believed the most dangerous secrets in her life were hidden inside spreadsheets. Naomi had spent 12 years learning that numbers rarely lied by themselves. People lied around them, buried them, renamed them, or moved them between columns until theft began to resemble routine business. That talent had carried her from a cramped audit office in Atlanta to international compliance work across Latin America. Her current assignment should have been boring. Meridian's expansion was already under investor and regulatory scrutiny, and Naomi's firm had promised an independent review rather than a ceremonial signature. Her managing partner warned that delays would irritate an important client. But Naomi had built her reputation by irritating clients before regulators had to. She was not looking for danger or romance, and she had no interest in entering the private life of anyone whose financial records she examined. At that point, Kang Min-jae was only a name on organizational charts, positioned several levels above the executives expected to answer her questions. Meridian Hansong Logistics had hired an outside firm to certify anti-money laundering controls before a major expansion at the port of Lázaro Cárdenas. Naomi had been assigned the Mexican subsidiaries because she spoke fluent Spanish and had learned never to trust a ledger simply because it looked clean. By 9 in the morning, she had already found 3 containers that supposedly carried automotive sensors but were billed through a shell company registered above a laundromat in Guadalajara. The shipping weights changed twice, while the insurance value remained strangely constant. Elena Ruiz leaned over Naomi's shoulder, read the vendor name, and muttered that anyone calling a shell company Blue Horizon Strategic Solutions deserved prison for lack of imagination alone. Naomi laughed, then highlighted a pattern of transfers that made her stop. Every suspicious shipment generated a consulting payment to a Seoul foundation called Hanul International Health. The amounts were too small to trigger automatic review, but they repeated at precise intervals after containers cleared customs. Naomi printed the transfer history and placed it beside the customs manifests. She had learned from her father's hidden gambling debts that the most expensive lies often began with payments small enough for everyone else to ignore. At noon, a Meridian executive named Park Jin-woo arrived with 2 attorneys and the relaxed smile of a man expecting auditors to remain politely stupid. He answered Naomi's first 6 questions, then began explaining why Asian business culture required flexibility. Naomi waited until he finished and asked why medical charity payments were attached to freight containers carrying machine parts. Park's smile vanished for half a second before he said the foundation sponsored employee health programs across the company's global offices. She asked why those health programs were booked as customs consulting. Park adjusted his cuff and told her the coding was probably clerical. Naomi wrote the word probably in the margin and underlined it twice. That evening, Elena wanted tacos and sleep. But Naomi returned to the warehouse, because one manifest showed a container inspected after the official gate had closed. She told herself she only needed a photograph of the seal number. The warehouse district after dark smelled of diesel, hot concrete, and rain collecting in cracked pavement. Naomi parked beneath a broken streetlight, sent Elena her location, and walked toward the loading bay with her phone camera already open. She noticed the black sedan before she noticed the men. It sat at the far end of the bay with its engine running, too clean for the yard, while 3 workers in orange vests stood without moving near a container marked MH4421. One of the workers touched his ear. Another reached beneath his vest. Naomi stopped beside a forklift and realized the men were not workers at all, because none of them wore steel-toed boots. The warehouse door opened behind them, and a tall Korean man stepped outside with 2 security guards. Naomi recognized him from Meridian's corporate website. Although the photographs had made Kang Min-jae look like another remote executive rather than someone whose presence changed the air around armed men. The first shot cracked through the bay before anyone spoke, and Min-jae's guard immediately pulled him toward the wall. The fake workers scattered while Naomi dropped behind the forklift, just as glass exploded from the office windows above her. She could have crawled toward her car. Instead, she saw a red laser move across the polished side of a parked truck, then climb toward Min-jae's shoulder from a position none of his guards were watching. Naomi shouted for him to move left. He obeyed without looking at her, and a bullet struck the metal door where his head had been less than a second earlier. A guard fired toward the upper catwalk. Naomi stayed low, counted 2 shooters by muzzle flashes, and noticed a third man using the forklift lane to circle behind Min-jae's team. She grabbed the forklift's emergency horn and held it down until the sudden blast startled the man circling behind Min-jae's team. Min-jae turned, disarmed the attacker, and drove him against the concrete with a brutal efficiency that looked nothing like corporate leadership. The gunfire stopped almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving the loading bay ringing with alarms, shouts, and falling glass. 2 attackers fled through the rear gate, one lay groaning near the loading ramp, and Min-jae stood over him with a pistol held low against his thigh. Naomi remained behind the forklift until Min-jae looked directly at her. His gaze moved from her face to the printed manifest still clenched in her hand, and then to the blood spreading across his guard's sleeve. He asked whether she was injured. Naomi said she was angry, which made one of the guards glance at her, as if anger were an unusual response to attempted murder. Min-jae walked toward her, and asked why an auditor was inside a warehouse after midnight. Naomi held up the manifest, and replied that apparently someone had scheduled a late meeting, without putting it on her calendar. For the first time, Min-jae almost smiled. Then he looked at the attacker on the ground and ordered his men in Korean to secure every exit before the police arrived. Naomi understood enough Korean from years of working with multinational clients to catch the word traitor. She did not understand why Meridian's chairman sounded less surprised by gunmen than by the possibility that someone inside his company had invited them. Police statements took 3 hours. Min-jae answered questions through an attorney, while Naomi gave the detective a precise description of the fake workers, the sedan, and the shooter on the catwalk. When the detective left, Min-jae offered Naomi a ride home because her car had taken a bullet through the windshield. She declined until she saw the hole over the driver's seat, and decided independence did not require stupidity. The armored sedan smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Min-jae sat across from her rather than beside her, leaving a deliberate distance that felt more respectful than the security guard checking mirrors every 30 seconds. He thanked her for the warning. Naomi said she had not saved him, because moving left had been his part of the arrangement. Min-jae replied that people usually remembered their own fear first. Naomi looked at the cut along his jaw and asked whether gunfire at warehouses was part of Meridian's standard executive wellness program. The dry question earned a brief laugh from Jun-ho in the front seat. Min-jae's eyes sharpened at the phrase wellness program. He asked why she mentioned it, and Naomi said medical foundation payments kept appearing beside suspicious customs invoices. The silence that followed was not empty. Jun-ho stopped laughing. Min-jae looked toward the dark window, and Naomi realized she had touched something far more sensitive than an accounting classification. At her apartment building, Min-jae handed her a silver fountain pen that had fallen from her folder in the warehouse. Naomi told him it was not hers. He glanced at the initials engraved on the cap and admitted it belonged to him. Naomi tried to return it, but he told her to keep it until the audit was finished, because he wanted an excuse to know whether she found the missing money. The following morning, Meridian's legal department asked Naomi's firm to remove her from the account for safety reasons. Naomi read the email twice, then called her managing partner and refused. Her partner reminded her that bullets were not a standard audit risk. Naomi replied that someone had tried to frighten either Meridian or the auditors away from MH 4421, which meant the records mattered more now than they had yesterday. Elena supported her decision for exactly 30 seconds before calling it professionally admirable and personally idiotic. She also changed the locks on Naomi's apartment and began sharing live locations whenever either woman worked late. 3 days later, Naomi discovered that the attack had not been aimed at her. An internal Meridian employee had opened the warehouse gate, using credentials assigned to Min-jae's regional director, Park Jin-woo. The same Park who had explained cultural flexibility to Naomi was also authorizing the suspicious charity transfers. She prepared a memorandum and expected corporate attorneys to bury it beneath committee language. Instead, Min-jae appeared in the conference room without warning, dismissed everyone except Naomi and Elena, and asked her to explain the pattern from the beginning. Naomi showed him the timed payments, the shell vendors, and the access records. She explained that Park was not simply stealing, he was using legitimate shipments to hide money moving somewhere else. Min-jae asked how certain she was. Naomi replied that certainty belonged in court. But if he gave her 48 hours and uncensored access to vendor records, she could tell him where the money was landing. He gave her 36 hours. Naomi told him deadlines did not become more intelligent when rich men shortened them. Min-jae said he had noticed. They worked until sunrise in a glass conference room overlooking Reforma. Naomi traced payments through 3 Mexican entities, 1 Panamanian account, and a sole consulting firm that existed only on paper. The final beneficiary was Hanel International Health, the same medical foundation Naomi had flagged on her first day. More disturbing was a second pattern showing transfers from Hanel back into accounts controlled by Park Jin-woo. Naomi expected Min-jae to call police. Instead, he stared at the screen for a long time and asked Elena to leave them alone. After the door closed, he told Naomi that Park had worked for his family for 17 years. He said betrayal inside a company could destroy more than money, especially when people outside the company were waiting for weakness. Naomi asked what kind of people. Min-jae answered that some competitors did not use lawyers, which was both an explanation and an avoidance. She told him she would not alter her report to protect his family. Min-jae said he would never ask, but he needed 24 hours before she transmitted the evidence to headquarters. Naomi refused. Her contract required immediate escalation of suspected laundering, and her career depended on remaining the one person in the room who could not be bought by urgency. Min-jae did not threaten her. He simply asked whether she always treated trust like a clause in a contract. Naomi looked at him and said trust was what existed after the clauses had been tested. Her father had taught her that affection without transparency could bankrupt an entire household. Min-jae absorbed the answer without asking for the story behind it. He signed the access authorization with another pen and told her to send the report. That choice surprised Naomi more than a threat would have. Powerful men often respected boundaries only after discovering whether they could break them. And Min-jae had just stepped back before she needed to force him. Park Jin-woo disappeared before Mexican authorities could question him. His apartment was empty, his accounts had been drained, and airport records showed no legal departure. The police called it flight. Min-jae called it cleanup, which was the first time he allowed Naomi to glimpse the language of the world behind his tailored suits. A week later, Naomi found a handwritten note beneath her windshield wiper. It contained no threat, only her home address in Atlanta and her mother's first name. She stared at the paper until Elena took it from her hand. The message worked because it did not need to say what might happen next. Naomi reported it to police, moved temporarily into a hotel, and informed her firm. By evening, 2 men were stationed outside the elevator, both wearing Meridian security badges. She called Min-jae and told him she had not requested bodyguards. He said he knew, and then made the mistake of saying she needed them. Naomi answered that necessity did not cancel consent. 10 minutes later, the guards left the hallway and took positions in the lobby instead. Min-jae called again and asked whether that arrangement was acceptable. Naomi said it was better, which was not the same as permission to control the rest of her life. Their arguments became a strange form of courtship before either of them recognized it. He would present a solution as if it were inevitable, and Naomi would return it with terms, boundaries, and questions he was unused to hearing. He began joining her for coffee in the hotel restaurant, always with Jun-ho somewhere nearby. Naomi learned Min-jae drank espresso without sugar, and read financial newspapers from the back pages forward. Min-jae learned Naomi hated papaya, carried 3 pens but borrowed his silver one anyway, and called Elena whenever stress made her tempted to work instead of sleep. On the 4th morning, Min-jae showed Naomi a photograph of Suwa sitting behind a cello with a blue scarf around her shoulders. He said his younger sister had been sick for years and hated being treated like a patient. Naomi asked what illness she had. Min-jae said an aggressive autoimmune kidney disease had gradually destroyed Suwa's kidney function. Suwa had remained stable for years, but she was now in advanced kidney failure, dependent on dialysis, and waiting for a transplant. Naomi offered sympathy without the false optimism sick families learn to resent. Min-jae thanked her and changed the subject. That night, alone in his suite, he called Seoul and listened while his father asked whether Naomi had agreed to the executive medical screening. Min-jae said no. Dae-sung reminded him that the preliminary tissue data from the Mexico clinic had already shown extraordinary compatibility, and that Sua's condition was deteriorating faster than expected. Min-jae asked again how Haniul had obtained Naomi's sample. His father replied that the method mattered less than the opportunity. The company wellness clinic had sold patient data through a subcontractor, and Dr. Park's network had flagged Naomi months before the audit placed her near Meridian. Dae-sung called the coincidence fortunate. Min-jae looked through the hotel window at the city and said Naomi was not an opportunity. His father asked whether that meant he had become sentimental. Dae-sung reminded him of their mother's final week, when a transplant never came, and Min-jae had stood outside intensive care, promising his 13-year-old sister that he would never let the same thing happen to her. The promise had shaped Min-jae's adulthood more than any title his father gave him. Dae-sung knew exactly where to press because he had built half his son's loyalties around that old hospital corridor. He told Min-jae the plan remained simple. Bring Naomi into the family circle, reveal Sua's need at the right moment, and persuade her to donate 1 kidney voluntarily. Min-jae asked whether coercion was involved. Dae-sung sounded offended by the question and said no surgeon could operate without consent. That answer should have reassured him. Instead, Min-jae noticed that his father had answered the legal question rather than the moral one. The next morning, Naomi found Min-jae waiting in the hotel lobby with 2 coffees. He handed her the cup made exactly the way she liked it, and did not mention the call from Seoul. For the first time, Min-jae understood that withholding the truth was not a temporary strategy anymore. It was becoming part of every ordinary moment they shared. Naomi's audit should have ended after the Park report, but the Mexican authorities requested additional assistance tracing the shell companies. Meridian retained her firm, and Min-jae remained in Mexico because the warehouse attack had exposed an internal power struggle. Their lives narrowed around the same investigation. Naomi followed money. Min-jae followed people, and each began discovering that the other's methods revealed what their own missed. Naomi found that Park Jin-woo had paid a security contractor connected to the Sinaloa coast. Min-jae's sources found the contractor had been hired by a Meridian board member trying to force him out of Latin America. Together, the information transformed the warehouse shooting from random violence into a failed internal coup. Naomi hated how satisfying it felt when their separate worlds aligned into one answer. Min-jae arranged a meeting with the board member at a restaurant closed to the public. Naomi told him she wanted no details if his version of corporate governance included broken bones. He said he preferred signatures when signatures worked. Naomi replied that this was the least comforting reassurance she had heard all month. That evening, the board member resigned, transferred stolen shares back to the company, and boarded a flight to Madrid. Naomi chose not to ask why his right hand had been bandaged. Instead, She asked Min-jae whether violence was his first language, or simply the one his family had taught him most fluently. He looked at her across the restaurant table and said survival had been the first language. Violence was the accent people noticed. The answer unsettled Naomi because it sounded practiced and true at the same time. She told herself empathy was not absolution, even when the person across from her made brutality sound like inheritance. 2 nights later, a storm flooded the streets around Reforma and knocked out power to half Naomi's hotel. She found Min-jae on the rooftop terrace because the elevators had stopped and neither of them felt like sitting in dark rooms. Rain hammered the glass awning. Mexico City spread below them in wet neon, and for once Junho stayed inside, giving them a privacy that neither had requested aloud. Naomi asked whether Min-jae ever wanted a life without security teams, family obligations, and people waiting for him to make one wrong move. He said wanting and choosing were different privileges. Naomi replied that people with his money usually confused privilege with permission. Min-jae laughed softly and asked what she would choose if she could redesign her life without consequences. Naomi said she would keep the work, lose the danger, buy a small house with a kitchen large enough for her mother, and stop dating men who lied badly. He asked whether that description included him. Naomi said they were not dating, which made him look toward the rain as if considering whether he had misunderstood several weeks of breakfast. Then he asked whether she wanted them to be. Naomi had spent years avoiding men who treated intensity as intimacy, and everything about Min-jae should have made the answer easy. Instead, she told him she wanted one evening where neither of them discussed blood, money, guns, or corporate crime. Min-jae agreed and asked if tacos violated any of those categories. Their first real date happened at a small restaurant. Elena recommended because nobody there cared who owned Meridian. Min-jae arrived without a tie, and Naomi discovered he looked younger when he was not dressed like a board meeting. They argued about music, traded stories about terrible first jobs, and laughed when Min-jae admitted he had once been fired from his father's warehouse at 19 for punching a supervisor. Naomi asked whether the supervisor deserved it. Min-jae said yes, then admitted his father rehired the man because he wanted Min-jae to learn that being right did not make him competent. The lesson sounded almost healthy until Naomi remembered the armed men who obeyed Min-jae without questions. She kept both truths in her mind, rather than choosing the more romantic one. At the end of the night, Min-jae walked her to the hotel entrance and waited. Naomi appreciated that he did not turn the pause into entitlement. She kissed him first. It was brief, deliberate, and warm enough to make the danger surrounding them feel temporarily distant. After Naomi went upstairs, Min-jae remained beneath the awning until Junho approached. Junho had worked for him long enough to recognize the expression Min-jae was trying to hide. Junho asked whether Dae-sung knew. Min-jae said his father knew everything that could be turned into leverage. Junho looked toward Naomi's lit window and warned that a woman was not safer simply because Min-jae had feelings for her. Sometimes feelings only made powerful men more inventive about calling control protection. Min-jae told him to watch his tone. Junho replied that Min-jae paid him for loyalty, not silence. The following week, Naomi's firm scheduled annual employee health checks at a private clinic contracted by Meridian. The coincidence irritated her, because Meridian had recently taken over several employee services during the security crisis. A nurse drew blood, frowned at the label, and asked Naomi to provide a second sample because the first tube might have been contaminated. Naomi refused until the clinic explained what was wrong with the first sample. The nurse left and returned with a supervisor who apologized, blamed a barcode issue, and said no repeat draw was necessary. Naomi photographed the original label before leaving. That night, she searched the clinic's parent company and found a subcontracting relationship with Hanal International Health. The same foundation had appeared beside the suspicious freight payments. Naomi sent the corporate records to Elena and told herself she was following an accounting lead. She did not yet allow herself to ask why a soul transplant charity kept appearing around her personal life. Min-jae arrived for dinner carrying lilies. Naomi showed him the clinic screenshot before he had removed his coat. He read the page without visible surprise and said Hanal funded health programs for Meridian employees worldwide. Naomi reminded him she had heard that explanation from Park Jin-woo before the man vanished. Min-jae said he would investigate. Naomi watched his face and felt the first small fracture between what he said and what he knew. She asked whether Hanul treated Sua. Min-jae answered yes. Naomi asked whether her own blood sample had any connection to his sister. Min-jae could have ended the lie there. Instead, he said no. The word came smoothly, quietly, and without hesitation. Naomi nodded, closed the laptop, and served dinner. Min-jae hated himself more because she believed him than he would have if she had called him a liar. In Seoul, Dae-sung received an update from Dr. Park confirming Naomi's unusually strong compatibility. Sua's kidney failure was worsening, and the family was running out of time. Dae-sung asked whether a voluntary donation remained medically plausible. Dr. Park said yes, but added that Naomi's refusal would create complications. Dae-sung rotated the family signet ring on his finger and said complications were simply decisions waiting for someone with authority. Neither man mentioned Min-jae's promise that coercion would never be used. By then, Dae-sung had already begun designing a plan that did not require his son's agreement. Min-jae returned to Seoul for 48 hours after Sua collapsed during a foundation rehearsal. He told Naomi the trip was urgent, but he did not tell her that his father met him at the private hospital treating Sua before he saw his sister. Dae-sung placed Naomi's compatibility report on a conference table and said the doctors could not wait forever. Min-jae pushed the pages back and reminded his father that Naomi had not consented to any testing beyond routine employee health screening. His father said consent could be obtained after marriage, when family responsibility was no longer theoretical. Min-jae asked whether he was suggesting a proposal as a medical strategy. Dae-sung answered that Min-jae was already considering marriage for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine, so pretending the two decisions were unrelated was sentimental nonsense. Min-jae walked away before his anger became useful to his father. He found Sua asleep near a window, her skin pale against a blue blanket, and an old cello score folded on the table beside her. When she woke, she smiled at him and asked about the American accountant, whose name had appeared twice in their phone conversations. Min-jae said Naomi was difficult, principled, funny when she forgot to protect herself, and very good at making him feel dishonest. Sua told him that last part sounded like a personal problem. Then she asked whether he loved Naomi. Min-jae looked toward the hospital glass and said he was trying not to. Sua laughed weakly and told him that strategy sounded less impressive than the criminal empire everyone was afraid of. He almost told her why Naomi's name mattered to the doctors. Instead, he kissed Sua's forehead and promised he would find a way to help her without destroying anyone else. Dae-sung heard about the promise from a nurse loyal to the family. He did not confront his son, because patience had always been one of his most effective forms of violence. When Min-jae returned to Mexico City, Naomi was standing inside Meridian's regional archive with 6 boxes of invoices, and the expression of someone who had found another problem she intended to make his. She had traced Hanul's payments into a chain of medical procurement companies that also bought refrigerated transport equipment through Meridian. Min-jae said medical logistics were legitimate business. Naomi agreed, then showed him that 3 suppliers had no employees and shared a registered address with a funeral services company. She asked whether he still wanted to call the arrangement routine. Min-jae took the documents and told her he would have internal security investigate. Naomi told him internal security reported to him, which made the phrase investigate sound suspiciously like disappear. He promised no documents would vanish. She asked whether people would. The question landed harder than she intended. Min-jae said he could not give her a life where every answer was clean. Naomi replied that she had not asked for clean, she had asked for honest. For several days, they spoke only about work. The distance was not dramatic enough to become an argument, but both of them felt it in the unused coffee cup across the conference table. Then the threat outside Naomi's hotel changed. A motorcycle followed Elena home, and someone sent Naomi a photograph of the 2 women eating lunch 3 weeks earlier. Min-jae moved Elena to a secured apartment with her consent, then showed Naomi the surveillance photograph without softening what it meant. He said the network behind Park Jin-woo had begun treating anyone near the audit as leverage. Naomi wanted to stay in Mexico, because leaving felt like surrender. Elena wanted her alive more than she wanted consistency. Elena told Naomi that bravery was not the same thing as remaining available to people with rifles. She also reminded her that evidence could be followed from another country. Min-jae offered Seoul as a temporary base. Naomi immediately refused because moving into his world would place her farther from her own support system. He did not argue. Instead, he gave her the name of an independent security consultant and said she could choose any city she wanted. The refusal to pressure her made the decision harder. Naomi spent the night reviewing work visas, flight options, and the evidence that every known threat remained tied to the Mexican investigation. 2 days later, she agreed to spend 6 weeks in Seoul while the case cooled. She insisted on her own apartment, her own legal counsel, and continued employment through her American firm. Min-jae accepted every condition. He did not mention that Dae-sung would interpret her arrival as progress. Before they left Mexico, Min-jae took Naomi to meet a civil attorney because cross-border security arrangements required formal medical directives and emergency contacts. The attorney explained that unmarried partners could face limitations during medical crises. Naomi noticed Min-jae become unusually still. She asked whether he had brought her there to propose through paperwork. He said no, because even he understood that proposing beside a stack of liability waivers would be unforgivable. That evening, they returned to the rooftop where rain had once given them permission to speak honestly. The city was dry this time, and Min-jae carried no ring. He told Naomi that his life was dangerous, complicated, and more morally compromised than she fully understood. He said she should never marry him, because she thought he could become harmless. Naomi asked why she should marry him at all. Min-jae answered that when he imagined losing the company, the family name, and every structure he had inherited, the one loss he could not make abstract anymore was her. She waited for something grander and realized he had chosen the most honest sentence he could offer without telling the truth he was still hiding. Naomi said marriage would not make her property, protection would never become permission, and any lie that changed her ability to choose would count as betrayal rather than privacy. Min-jae agreed to every condition, while knowing he had already violated the last one. The shame was immediate, but fear made him selfish enough to continue. Naomi accepted his proposal only after calling Elena, her mother, and an attorney who asked several unpleasant questions about Korean marital property law. They married quietly at a civil registry in Mexico City, before flying to Seoul. Naomi wore a cream suit, Min-jae wore charcoal, and Elena cried harder than either person getting married. When the clerk handed Naomi the marriage license, Min-jae offered his silver fountain pen. She signed with it, then drew a tiny line beneath her name because she still liked testing whether the ink would smear. Min-jae watched the gesture and almost confessed. The moment passed because human beings are remarkably talented at postponing the truth until it becomes more expensive. Seoul greeted Naomi with cold spring rain and cameras outside Incheon Airport. Meridian had announced the marriage before their flight landed, turning a private decision into corporate news. Naomi stopped walking when she saw her own face on a business channel screen above the arrivals hall. Min-jae admitted his public relations team had released a statement to prevent speculation. She asked why he had not consulted the person being speculated about. Min-jae apologized, then instructed the team to remove all personal details beyond the marriage itself. The correction mattered, but it also showed Naomi how instinctively his world acted first and requested forgiveness later. Her apartment was technically separate from the Kang family residence, although it occupied a secured building owned by Meridian 3 blocks away. Naomi insisted on paying rent at market value. Dae-sung called the decision unnecessary. Naomi replied that unnecessary independence was still independence. Their first formal family dinner took place at the Kang residence, a modern hillside house designed to look serene enough that nobody would guess armed men monitored its gates. Soo-ah met Naomi at the entrance instead of waiting to be introduced. She wore a soft blue sweater, moved carefully, and hugged Naomi before anyone could decide whether the gesture was appropriate. Naomi liked her immediately. Soo-ah said she had wanted to meet the woman who made Min-jae answer messages during meetings, because apparently international finance had achieved what family discipline never could. Dae-sung welcomed Naomi in fluent English and called the marriage unexpected but fortunate. The word fortunate touched the same nerve as the clinic's repeated blood draw. Naomi asked what he meant. Dae-sung smiled and said Min-jae had spent years avoiding personal happiness. Aunt Mi-suk arrived late wearing pearls and an expression polite enough to survive legal review. She complimented Naomi's Korean pronunciation, then asked whether American families found international marriages easier because traditions were less strict. Naomi answered that American families had plenty of traditions, including asking direct questions when someone was being indirect. Soo-ah covered a smile with her water glass. Mi-suk changed tactics and asked whether Naomi intended to continue working after marriage. Naomi said yes. Unless Korean law had recently classified forensic accounting as a contagious disease. Min-jae lowered his eyes to hide his amusement. Dae-sung did not. During dinner, Dr. Park Seung-hun joined them without prior introduction. He was presented as an old family friend and Soo-ah's physician, but he paid more attention to Naomi's health than social curiosity required. He asked whether she had ever undergone abdominal surgery, whether she took medication, and whether hypertension ran in her family. Naomi set down her chopsticks and asked whether he normally conducted medical interviews over grilled fish. Dr. Park laughed and said doctors became boring dinner guests. Naomi replied that auditors became suspicious ones. Min-jae changed the subject, but Naomi noticed his hand tighten once around the stem of his glass. Later, Soo-ah apologized for the interrogation and invited Naomi to her music room. A cello rested near the window, untouched beneath a light cloth. Soo-ah admitted she had stopped performing publicly because fatigue made her hands unreliable. She played Naomi an old recording instead, a slow piece whose final note seemed to remain in the room after the speakers went silent. Naomi asked whether Soo-ah was on a transplant list. Soo-ah said yes, but compatibility and timing had become difficult. She also said her father treated medicine like a business problem that could be solved by applying enough pressure. Naomi said bodies had a rude habit of refusing corporate strategy. Soo-ah smiled and said that was exactly why she wanted Naomi in the family. For the first month in Seoul, Naomi built an ordinary life inside an extraordinary security perimeter. She worked American hours from her apartment, learned the subway despite Junho's objections, and found a bakery where nobody cared about the Kang name. Min-jae spent nights with her whenever his schedule allowed. Sometimes they discussed dangerous matters. Sometimes they watched bad television and argued over whether subtitles improved Korean reality shows. Those quiet evenings became the cruelest part of the later betrayal because nothing about them felt staged. Min-jae cooked badly but washed dishes with military precision. Naomi left financial journals on his sofa, and he pretended not to notice when her curls clogged his bathroom drain. They were not constantly dramatic. They were married, which meant intimacy often arrived, disguised as groceries, forgotten chargers, shared umbrellas, and the argument over who had finished the coffee. Naomi began believing that whatever darkness surrounded Min-jae's work, their private life had boundaries he would not cross. The first month of marriage taught Naomi how easily danger could hide inside ordinary domestic routines. She worked American hours from her apartment, learned the subway despite Junho's objections, and found a bakery where nobody cared about the Kang name. Min-jae spent nights with her whenever his schedule allowed, sometimes discussing threats, sometimes watching terrible television and arguing about subtitles. Those quiet evenings would later become the cruelest part of the betrayal because almost nothing about them had felt staged. Min-jae cooked badly but washed dishes with military precision. Naomi left financial journals on his sofa, and he tolerated her curls clogging his bathroom drain. They were married, and intimacy often arrived, disguised as groceries, forgotten chargers, shared umbrellas, and arguments about who had finished the coffee. Naomi began believing that whatever darkness surrounded Min-jae's family, their private life still contained boundaries he would never cross. At the same time, Soo-ah's kidneys were failing faster than her doctors had expected, and dialysis was no longer giving her enough stability. The family had money, influence, and access to specialists, but none of those things could manufacture a lawful compatible donor on command. Dae-sung treated that fact as an insult rather than a medical reality. He summoned Min-jae to the family residence and placed Naomi's compatibility report on the table between them. The report had been assembled from stolen wellness data, follow-up laboratory samples, and private records Naomi had never agreed to share. Min-jae refused to touch the pages. Dae-sung asked whether refusing to touch paper made the information disappear. Min-jae said Naomi would never agree if she learned how the family had obtained her medical data. Dae-sung answered that agreement was a luxury people discussed when time was not killing someone they loved. Min-jae warned him that Naomi was not an asset, a donor file, or a problem to be solved. His father asked why Min-jae had married her if he truly believed those categories could be separated from family survival. The accusation hit because it contained enough truth to hurt. Min-jae had loved Naomi when he proposed, but he had also known why his father wanted her close. He had told himself, love transformed the original lie into something different. In reality, love had only made the lie more expensive. Soo-ah knew none of this. She believed Naomi's blood had been tested only during ordinary employee screening in Mexico. When Naomi Vimy visited her after mime, Soo-ah apologized for being tired and asked whether marriage had made her brother any less impossible. Naomi said marriage had made him easier to locate when he was being impossible. Soo-ah laughed until the effort made her cough. Then admitted she was frightened that her body was running out of time. Naomi took her hand and said fear did not make her weak. She added that, if there were anything reasonable she could do to help, Soo-ah only had to ask. Soo-ah squeezed her fingers and said she wanted company, not sacrifice. The sentence stayed with Naomi because it sounded exactly like the kind of dignity she respected. It stayed with Min-jae for a different reason after Soo-ah repeated it to him that evening. For several days, he tried to build a lawful alternative. He contacted transplant programs, searched extended family records, and offered to fund every legal donor search expense available to Soo-ah. Nothing produced the answer Dae-sung wanted quickly enough. Dr. Park told the family that Soo-ah could survive more waiting. But every week increased the possibility of another crisis. Dae-sung translated possibility into certainty, and certainty into permission. He told Min-jae that a private surgical team could perform the transplant outside the registered hospital system. The room already existed beneath a secluded rehabilitation property the family controlled outside Seoul. It was not a hospital, had no public admissions desk, and appeared nowhere in any government registry as a surgical facility. Dr. Park had equipped it over the years for procedures the family did not want connected to ordinary records. Min-jae stared at his father and asked whether he was describing kidnapping his own wife. Dae-sung said he was describing saving his daughter, before two sentimental people allowed morality to kill her. Min-jae walked out and spent the night driving without a destination. He returned to Naomi just before dawn and found her asleep on the sofa with a spreadsheet open across her laptop. She woke when he covered her with a blanket and immediately noticed something was wrong. Min-jae said Soo-ah had suffered another bad dialysis session. Naomi sat up and asked what the doctors were saying. He told her they needed a donor soon, then stopped before saying the one fact that mattered most. Naomi asked whether he wanted her to come with him to see Soo-ah the next day. Min-jae said yes, and the answer felt like the first step toward a cliff he could already see. The following afternoon, Naomi brought Soo-ah a small box of pastries from the bakery near her apartment. Soo-ah ate half of one, and complained that hospital diets seemed designed by people who considered seasoning a moral weakness. For 2 hours, the women talked about music, Atlanta, marriage, and the ordinary future Soo-ah hoped to have after transplant. Naomi left believing the family was frightened but still operating within the limits of medicine. Min-jae watched her leave the room and hated how completely she trusted him. That night, Dae-sung told his son the hidden surgical team would be ready within 48 hours. Min-jae said there would be no operation without Naomi's consent. Dae-sung asked whether Min-jae was willing to watch Soo-ah die in order to preserve a principle. Naomi would never know, he defended. Min-jae said he would tell Naomi everything, and let her decide. His father replied that, if he did, Naomi would leave, contact the authorities, and destroy the family before Soo-ah received help. Min-jae knew the prediction might be manipulative, but he also knew Naomi well enough to understand that much of it was probably true. For the first time, he began treating her integrity as an obstacle instead of the quality that had made him love her. The change happened quietly, which made it more dangerous. He did not suddenly become a different man. He became the same man under enough pressure to reveal which promise he would break first. Naomi noticed his distance over dinner and asked whether he was regretting the marriage. Min-jae looked genuinely startled and said no. She asked whether there was someone else, and he almost laughed from the cruelty of how innocent that possibility sounded. He told her the problem was family, not another woman. Naomi reached across the table and told him he did not have to carry every family crisis by himself. Min-jae covered her hand with his and nearly confessed. Then his phone vibrated with a message from Dae-sung saying Soo-ah had been taken back for emergency stabilization. Min-jae stood so quickly the chair struck the wall. Naomi rose with him and said she was coming. He told her no, then saw the confusion on her face, and changed the answer to not yet. He drove to the hospital alone and found Soo-ah unconscious, after a severe episode, surrounded by machines and exhausted staff. Dr. Park said she had stabilized, but the next crisis could be harder to reverse. Dae-sung stood at the foot of the bed, and said nothing until Min-jae looked at him. Then he asked one question. How many more chances did his son think they had? Min-jae spent 20 minutes alone beside Soo-ah, remembering the promise he had made when they were children after their mother's death. He had promised his little sister that he would never let her die, waiting for someone else to decide whether she deserved to live. It was a promise made by a frightened boy, but the frightened boy still existed inside the man Naomi had married. When Min-jae left the room, Dae-sung was waiting in the corridor. Min-jae asked what would happen to Naomi after the operation. Dae-sung said she would receive the best private care money could buy and could live a full life with one kidney. Min-jae asked what would happen if there were complications. His father answered that every surgery carried risk, as though the absence of consent were merely another line on a medical form. Min-jae should have walked away then. Instead, he asked how long the hidden surgical team needed. That question became the moment. He crossed the line he would later spend years trying and failing to explain. The plan did not require Naomi to sign anything because Dr. Park intended to fabricate the private paperwork afterward. Min-jae refused to hear procedural details and told himself that refusing details preserved some part of his innocence. It did not. All he needed to know was that Naomi had to arrive unconscious at the private property outside Seoul before midnight the next evening. Dae-sung expected security staff to handle it. Min-jae said no one else would touch her before she was unconscious. He framed the demand as protection. In truth, it meant he wanted to control the betrayal personally. The following day, Naomi received a message from Min-jae asking her to have dinner with him at a quiet house the family used outside the city. He said he needed privacy to discuss Soo-ah and something he should have told Naomi earlier. Those words made Naomi nervous, but they also sounded like the honesty she had been demanding from him for months. She told Elena where she was going and sent the property location as a routine safety habit. Min-jae met her at the door without guards visible nearby. The house was warm, understated, and deliberately ordinary compared with the formal Kang residence. Naomi saw 2 plates on the dining table and believed he had finally chosen a private place to tell her the truth. He served food but barely touched his own. Naomi asked directly whether this was about Soo-ah needing a transplant. Min-jae said yes. She asked whether the family wanted something from her. His silence answered too much. Naomi put down her fork and asked whether she was compatible. Min-jae said the doctors believed she might be. The word might was another lie, softer than the others and somehow more cowardly. Naomi stared at him and asked how they could possibly know. Min-jae said there had been irregularities with the employee clinic in Mexico and promised he would explain everything. Naomi stood and said he could begin now. Min-jae asked her to sit for 1 more minute. She refused, picked up her bag, and said she would not discuss her body inside a family property after learning her medical information had been taken without permission. Min-jae moved between her and the door, not touching her, but blocking the easiest path. Naomi's expression changed immediately. She told him to move. For 1 second, the man who loved her and the man trained to control danger seemed to fight behind the same face. Min-jae stepped aside. Naomi walked past him and reached the entry hall. Then dizziness rolled through her so suddenly she caught the wall with one hand. She looked back toward the dining table. Then at the untouched glass Min-jae had poured for her when she arrived. Naomi whispered his name. Min-jae crossed the room before her knees gave way and caught her against his chest. She tried to push him off, but her arms no longer obeyed with normal strength. Her voice came out uneven when she asked what he had given her. Min-jae said nothing. Naomi looked directly into his face and asked what he had done to her. He held her tighter because she was sliding toward the floor. She told him not to touch her. The words were weak, but the meaning was unmistakable. Min-jae whispered that he was sorry. Naomi asked what he was sorry for. He could not answer before her eyes lost focus. The last clear thing she saw was her husband's face above hers, wet with tears he had no right to ask her to understand. Min-jae carried Naomi to the waiting car himself. Junho was not there because Min-jae had deliberately reassigned him to Sua's hospital security that evening. Two men loyal to Dae-sung drove while Min-jae sat beside Naomi in the back seat, holding her hand after she could no longer choose whether he touched it. The car left the city and entered a wooded property surrounded by a high stone wall. Beneath the main rehabilitation building, a freight elevator opened into a concrete corridor, with no public signs and no patient reception area. The hidden surgical room at the end of that corridor was bright, cold, and frightening precisely because it looked professionally maintained. There were medical lights, stainless equipment, sealed cabinets, and staff wearing masks without identification badges. Nothing about the place gave Naomi the protections of a real hospital. There was no admissions record, no independent advocate, no family contact, and no legitimate consent process. Dr. Park met Min-jae outside the room and said Sua had already been prepared at another secured location. Min-jae asked whether Naomi would wake safely. Dr. Park answered that he expected her to recover. It was not the same as a promise. Min-jae looked through the small glass panel in the door and saw Naomi lying motionless beneath white sheets. For the first time that night, the enormity of what he had chosen stopped being theoretical. He reached for the door handle. Dae-sung stepped beside him and said going inside would change nothing except making the surgeons nervous. Min-jae said they should stop. His father asked whether he wanted Sua returned to dialysis. Until the next crisis killed her. Min-jae stood frozen long enough for the surgical room door to close from the inside. He did not stop them. That failure became more important than every excuse he would later offer. Naomi remembered almost nothing from the hours that followed. There were fragments of light, pressure, distant voices, and the sensation of trying to wake inside a body that would not respond. When awareness returned clearly, the room was dimmer and smaller. She was lying on a narrow recovery cot with an intravenous line taped to her arm and a heavy dressing along one side of her abdomen. Pain arrived before memory did. It was deep, unfamiliar, and terrifying, because it belonged to something Naomi could not yet name. She tried to sit up and immediately gasped. A woman in scrubs told her to remain still. Naomi asked where she was. The woman avoided the question and checked a monitor instead. Naomi asked for her husband. The woman left the room. Naomi looked down, saw the dressing, and felt panic spread through her faster than the weakness could contain it. She touched the edge of the bandage and asked what they had done. No one answered. She tried to pull the blanket aside, but her hands were trembling too badly. The door opened again. Min-jae stepped inside. His shirt was wrinkled, his face had not been shaved, and there was dried blood on one cuff from where Naomi's intravenous line had leaked during transfer. Naomi stared at him as memory returned in pieces. The dinner, the glass, the wall beneath her hand, his arms catching her. She asked where they had taken her. Min-jae said she was safe now. Naomi laughed once, a broken sound that made the word safe feel obscene. She asked what was missing from her body. Min-jae could not answer. Naomi repeated the question more slowly. A tear moved down Min-jae's face before he finally said one kidney had been removed. For several seconds, Naomi seemed not to understand the sentence. Then she asked where it was. Min-jae looked away. Naomi knew before he spoke. He told her Sua had received the kidney. Naomi turned her face toward the wall and made a sound Min-jae would remember longer than any gunshot he had ever heard. She did not scream at first. She cried with the stunned silence of someone whose mind was still trying to reject a fact her body had already been forced to accept. Then she looked back at him and asked whether Sua knew. Min-jae said she had been told an emergency-compatible donor had become available. Naomi asked whether his sister knew the donor was her. He said no. Naomi asked whether he knew before the dinner what was going to happen. Min-jae said yes. That answer destroyed the last place Naomi had been trying to hide from the truth. She had still been hoping his father had acted behind his back. She had still been hoping the drugged drink was some misunderstanding she had not yet understood. There was no misunderstanding left. The man she loved had known. The man she married had carried her unconscious body into the place where part of it was taken. Min-jae moved closer and began the plea Naomi would later remember as the cruelest contradiction of their marriage. He insisted that he had loved her and had never married her merely to use her. Naomi looked at the surgical dressing beneath the blanket and asked what word he preferred instead. Min-jae said the relationship became real long before the operation. Naomi answered that reality had not protected her kidney. He said he had been trapped between losing his sister and betraying his wife. Naomi told him he was not trapped because he had made a choice. He simply hated the name of the choice after seeing what it had done. Min-jae said he would spend the rest of his life making it right. Naomi stared at him and said there was no way to put the organ back into the body he had stolen it from. The sentence finally broke whatever composure he had left. He lowered his head, but Naomi felt no comfort in his grief. His pain was proof that he understood the damage, not proof that he had earned forgiveness. Naomi asked to leave. Min-jae said she needed medical observation for several more hours. Naomi told him she would rather risk a real emergency room than spend another minute under the care of people who had cut into her without permission. Min-jae hesitated. Naomi saw the hesitation and understood that even now he was calculating whether to honor her choice. She told him if he stopped her from leaving, he would have to admit that the kidnapping had never ended. Min-jae opened the door. That was the first choice he gave back after taking away the one that mattered most. Junho arrived at the property 20 minutes later after discovering that Min-jae had diverted him with a false security assignment. He found Naomi sitting in the back seat of a car, wrapped in a coat, barely able to remain upright. The moment he saw the dressing beneath her clothing, Junho understood enough to stop asking Min-jae for an explanation. He asked Naomi where she wanted to go. She gave the name of a legitimate university hospital and told him not to let anyone from the Kang family follow them inside. Min-jae started to protest, then stopped when Naomi looked at him. Junho drove her away, while Min-jae remained standing beneath the lights of the hidden building. Naomi did not look back. At the university hospital, doctors confirmed that one kidney had been surgically removed only hours earlier. They treated the immediate complications, documented the wound, contacted authorities, and asked Naomi whether she knew who had authorized the procedure. Naomi said nobody had. The words sounded impossible even to her as she spoke them. A police officer asked whether she wanted her husband contacted. Naomi said her husband was the reason she was there. Rebecca Hall arrived before sunrise, after Junho called the number Naomi kept listed for independent legal emergencies. Rebecca listened, wrote down names, and told the medical staff that no Kang representative was authorized to access Naomi's room or records. Elena joined by video from Mexico City and cried before Naomi did. That reaction almost broke Naomi, because it was the first response that treated what happened as a violation rather than a family crisis. Naomi's mother flew from Atlanta the next morning. Denise Carter entered the hospital room carrying a small overnight bag and the expression of a woman trying not to collapse before her daughter did. Naomi apologized for frightening her. Denise told her never to apologize for surviving something another person chose to do. For the first 2 days, Naomi's world narrowed to pain control, sleep, water, short walks, police questions, and the humiliating dependence of needing help to sit upright. She hated how vulnerable her own body felt to her. The scar was not yet something symbolic or powerful. It was simply evidence that someone she trusted had made a decision inside her body without her permission. Every time Naomi closed her eyes, she remembered Min-jae catching her as the sedative took effect. The tenderness of that memory made it worse. He had held her carefully while delivering her to people who would cut her open. On the third day, Min-jae requested permission to visit. Naomi refused. He sent no flowers after Rebecca warned that every object from him would be returned unopened. Instead, he sent a written statement through his attorney saying he would surrender his phone, travel records, private messages, and financial access logs to investigators. Naomi read only the first page before handing it back. She was not ready to turn his cooperation into another emotional performance she was expected to evaluate. Across the city, Soo-ah woke from transplant surgery, believing an anonymous emergency donor had saved her life. Her doctors told her the new kidney was functioning, but the family maintained tight control over what information reached her room. Soo-ah asked to see Naomi, because she had been told Naomi was away on urgent work. Dae-sung said Naomi had returned to the United States after a marital disagreement. Soo-ah knew her father lied most effectively when his voice became calm. She called Min-jae from a nurse's phone after her own device disappeared. He answered, and remained silent when she asked where Naomi was. Soo-ah understood enough to become frightened. She demanded to know who the donor had been. Min-jae told her the truth. The call ended with Soo-ah vomiting from shock and then ordering the nurse to contact an independent attorney. She told the medical team she wanted her father removed from all decision-making authority immediately. When Soo-ah asked whether the kidney could somehow be returned, the transplant physician explained that there was no simple undoing of what had already happened. Soo-ah cried because she was alive inside a body that now carried evidence of another woman's violation. She asked to speak with Naomi. Naomi refused the first call. She refused the second as well. On the third day, Soo-ah sent a voice message through Rebecca instead of calling directly. She said she had not known, had never consented to receiving Naomi's kidney, and would testify against anyone responsible. Soo-ah did not ask for forgiveness. She said only that she was sorry Naomi had been made to pay for her survival. Naomi listened once, and then turned the phone face down. There was no clean emotional response available. She believed Soo-ah was innocent, but innocence did not make the stolen organ disappear from Soo-ah's body. Naomi could know exactly who was responsible, and still feel pain when she imagined the person benefiting from what had been taken. That contradiction became one of the hardest parts of recovery. A week after surgery, investigators showed Naomi photographs of the property where she had been operated on. The rehabilitation estate was legally registered to a Meridian charitable subsidiary and contained no licensed operating theater on official plans. The underground room had been cleared before police arrived. Equipment was gone, hard drives were missing, and the freight elevator had been scrubbed until even ordinary fingerprints were difficult to recover. Dae-sung had expected trouble. Min-jae's cooperation became the first reason the hidden room did not disappear entirely from the case. He provided internal property records showing renovations, power upgrades, medical equipment purchases, and security changes concealed under rehabilitation expenses. He also admitted that he had personally brought Naomi to the property while she was unconscious. That admission changed his legal status from protected family witness to a direct participant in the crime. His attorneys urged him to describe Dae-sung as the controlling force and himself as a son acting under extreme coercion. Min-jae refused to claim that pressure erased choice. He said his father created the situation, but he had still chosen to drug his wife and deliver her to the room. Naomi learned about that statement from Rebecca, not from Min-jae. For the first time since waking, she felt something other than rage toward him. It was not forgiveness, it was the painful recognition that he was finally naming the act correctly. 2 weeks after surgery, Naomi left the hospital and moved into a secured apartment arranged through independent counsel. Her mother stayed with her, while Elena temporarily relocated from Mexico to help with both work and recovery. Naomi could walk farther each day, but physical improvement did not make ordinary objects feel ordinary again. A glass left unattended at a restaurant could make her stomach tighten. The sound of a car door locking could stop a conversation in her throat. She stopped drinking anything she had not watched being opened or poured. She hated that Min-jae's betrayal had entered habits as small as taking a sip of water. Denise never told her to be strong. She made soup, washed clothes, sat nearby during nightmares, and let Naomi decide when silence was better than conversation. Elena handled work calls and cursed efficiently enough for both of them. Rebecca handled prosecutors, medical records, and the growing number of reporters trying to identify the mysterious American woman at the center of the investigation. Naomi handled what she knew best, when her mind finally became steady enough to work. She opened the financial records Min-jae had surrendered and started following the money. The hidden surgical room had not appeared in hospital budgets because it was financed through logistics, maintenance, charitable rehabilitation, and private security contracts. One company paid for electrical upgrades. Another purchased medical refrigeration equipment. A third rented vehicles that moved between airports, clinics, and the rehabilitation estate at irregular hours. Individually, the expenses looked unrelated. Together, they formed a shadow medical system built inside Meridian's legitimate infrastructure. Naomi created a transaction map and marked every payment connected to Dr. Park. Elena cross-referenced the accounts with travel data from Mexico, the Philippines, Thailand, and South Korea. The pattern led to names Naomi had seen before in the Hanul charity records. Mateo Serrano, a former Meridian driver from Mexico, had died after an unexplained private procedure years earlier. His widow had received a settlement from a Kang-controlled foundation 7 days later. Liza Mercado, a hotel worker from the Philippines, had disappeared from official employment records after being brought to Korea under a temporary visa. Rebecca located Liza through a remittance account that was still sending money to her mother in Cebu. Liza was alive. She agreed to speak only after Rebecca explained that Naomi herself had recently lost a kidney without consent. During the video call, Liza described being told that doctors needed to remove a dangerous abdominal growth. She woke with a surgical wound and later learned through an independent physician that one kidney was gone. Representatives connected to Hanul paid her family and threatened immigration consequences if she complained. Naomi listened without interrupting. For the first time, her own scar became evidence inside a larger pattern rather than an isolated family betrayal. That realization did not reduce her pain. It gave the pain direction. The investigation also forced Naomi to confront a practical question she had avoided. How much of her marriage had been financed through the same network that targeted her? She asked Elena to audit the accounts connected to their travel, apartment, wedding expenses, and private security. Most of the spending came from ordinary Meridian executive funds, but several medical security charges were routed through the same shell companies that financed the underground suite. Naomi stared at the entries for a long time. Even memories that had felt private had been surrounded by infrastructure built for the family's secret purpose. Elena warned her not to let accounting records rewrite every affectionate moment into fraud. Naomi said she knew, but knowledge did not stop the contamination from spreading backward through memory. The rooftop in Mexico had been real. The first kiss had been real. The hidden donor file had also existed while both moments were happening. Learning to hold those facts together, without allowing one to erase another, became exhausting emotional work. Rebecca eventually suggested Naomi create 2 separate timelines. One for what she had known at each moment, and another for what Min-jae had known. The exercise was painful, but it exposed something important. Naomi's decisions had been rational based on the information available to her. The deception belonged to the person who controlled the missing information, not to the person who trusted the version she was given. That realization loosened some of the shame she had been carrying since the surgery. She stopped asking how she could have been foolish enough to love him. She began asking how deliberately he had shaped the conditions under which love became possible. The answer remained complicated because Min-jae had manipulated access and still developed genuine attachment. Complication, Naomi learned, did not weaken responsibility. It simply prevented responsibility from being replaced by a comforting cartoon of pure evil. That distinction later became central to how she spoke publicly about coercive relationships. Danger did not always arrive through a person who felt dangerous every day. Sometimes it arrived through the person who remembered how you took your coffee and still decided your body could be used for someone else's emergency. She told Rebecca she wanted the case built around every victim they could prove, not around the spectacle of a Mafia wife betrayed by her husband. Rebecca agreed. Elena said that was the first thing Naomi had sounded passionate about since the surgery. Naomi replied that anger was easier to carry when it had somewhere useful to go. 3 weeks after the operation, Min-jae asked for one meeting before prosecutors formally charged him. Naomi refused twice. On the third request, he added that he would accept any location, any witnesses, and any condition she chose. Naomi agreed to a conference room inside Rebecca's law office with 2 investigators nearby. Min-jae entered without security and stopped several feet from the table. Naomi noticed immediately that he did not approach until she told him where to sit. The small obedience almost made her angry, because it proved he had always understood how consent worked. He had simply decided it mattered less when his sister's life was involved. Min-jae placed a folder on the table containing property records, private messages with Dae-sung, and the instructions that prepared the hidden room. Naomi asked whether he had known she would lose a kidney when he handed her the drug drink. He said yes. She asked whether he had hoped she would forgive him after Sua survived. Min-jae said he had been arrogant enough to imagine that love might make forgiveness possible. Naomi told him that was the part she found most frightening. He had not thought she was worthless. He had believed her love was valuable enough to be spent on his behalf. Min-jae lowered his eyes. Naomi told him he might genuinely have loved her. But when love finally demanded that he pay a price, he chose to make her body pay instead. Min-jae did not defend himself. He said there was no sentence he could offer that would make what happened smaller. Naomi agreed. Then she asked the question that had followed her through every sleepless night. If Sua had needed Naomi's heart instead of 1 kidney, where would Min-jae have drawn the line? Min-jae could not answer. Naomi said his silence was the most honest answer he had ever given her. Before leaving, Min-jae gave Rebecca written consent to access every Meridian archive he still controlled. He also transferred copies of the family security logs to prosecutors and agreed not to contact Naomi directly again unless she initiated it. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. Naomi cried only after he left, furious that grief could survive even after trust had died. The next morning, Dae-sung requested a private settlement meeting through 3 separate attorneys. Naomi declined all 3 requests. His 4th message contained a number large enough to buy several houses, fund lifelong medical care, and erase every debt her mother had ever carried. The offer required confidentiality, withdrawal of civil claims, and a public statement describing the surgery as a tragic family misunderstanding. Naomi read the document twice. Then she asked Rebecca to send back 1 sentence. A stolen kidney was not a misunderstanding. Dae-sung stopped pretending after that. Anonymous accounts began publishing claims that Naomi had volunteered to donate and changed her story only after her marriage collapsed. A photograph appeared online showing Naomi smiling beside Sua months before the surgery. Commentators used the image as proof that a willing donation had been transformed into revenge. The campaign nearly worked because the truth was more complicated than a headline. Naomi had loved Sua. She had said she would do anything reasonable to help her. She had even discussed transplant fears with Min-jae. None of those things meant she had surrendered ownership of a kidney. Rebecca advised silence until prosecutors could secure more evidence. Naomi agreed, even though remaining silent while strangers described her consent felt like being robbed a second time. Sua refused to remain silent. Still recovering from transplant surgery, she asked an independent attorney to record a statement for investigators. She said Naomi had never offered her a kidney, and she herself had never knowingly accepted one from Naomi. She confirmed that Dae-sung had controlled access to her phone and doctors during the critical days before the transplant. Most painfully, Sua told investigators that her father had repeatedly said family survival mattered more than individual comfort. She had thought he meant emotional sacrifice. Only after the surgery did she understand how literally he meant it. Sua asked to meet Naomi in person. Naomi was not ready. She sent a message through Rebecca saying she believed Sua had not chosen what happened, but she needed distance from everyone connected to the transplant. Sua accepted the boundary without protest. That response mattered more to Naomi than any apology could have at that moment. Korean prosecutors used Min-jae's records, Sua's testimony, and Naomi's transaction map to obtain warrants for the rehabilitation estate and several Meridian offices. The hidden surgical room had been stripped, but investigators found construction invoices, concealed ventilation plans, and archived security footage stored on an off-site server. One recovered video showed Naomi being carried from the car while unconscious. Min-jae was visible beside her. Naomi watched only the first few seconds before asking Rebecca to stop the recording. She did not need to see herself powerless in order to prove she had been powerless. Another file showed Dr. Park supervising medical deliveries to the unlicensed underground suite on multiple earlier dates. The dates matched payments connected to Mateo Serrano and Liza Mercado. The case widened from one illegal transplant into a pattern of coercive medical crimes hidden inside a criminal business network. Dr. Park attempted to leave South Korea using documents arranged through a Meridian subsidiary. He was arrested before boarding the flight. Dae-sung called an emergency board meeting and accused Min-jae of destroying the company over a woman who had already left him. Min-jae answered that Naomi leaving was not the cause of the destruction. It was evidence of what the family had already become. He resigned as chairman and transferred control of compliance archives to an independent committee before Dae-sung could lock the systems. That decision made thousands of internal records available to investigators without requiring the Kang patriarch's approval. For the first time, Min-jae used inherited power to make himself less powerful. It did not redeem him. It made prosecution easier. Dae-sung was arrested 2 days later on charges connected to kidnapping, medical coercion, conspiracy, obstruction, and financial crimes. He did not resist. As officers escorted him from the family residence, he asked whether Naomi understood how many people would lose jobs because she had chosen revenge. Naomi was not present, but the question reached her through an investigator. She answered later in her formal statement that accountability was not revenge simply because powerful people disliked the consequences. Min-jae was charged separately. His cooperation reduced some exposure, but prosecutors refused to treat him as merely a witness because he had personally participated in drugging and transporting Naomi. His attorney asked whether Naomi would submit a statement supporting leniency because Min-jae had later cooperated. Naomi said no. She also refused to submit a statement demanding the harshest possible sentence. She told Rebecca the court could measure punishment without turning her grief into a bargaining instrument. The decision surprised reporters who wanted anger simple enough to fit inside a quotation. Naomi's anger was not simple. She still remembered Min-jae making coffee, waiting outside elevators, laughing in the rain, and washing dishes after midnight. Those memories had not become fake just because the man inside them later committed an unforgivable act. That was what made the betrayal devastating. If every tender moment had been false, Naomi could have buried the marriage as a scam. Instead, she had to live with the harder truth that someone could love her and still decide her consent mattered less than his fear. The distinction changed the central question of her recovery. She stopped asking whether Min-jae had loved her. Eventually, she began asking why love had ever been treated as evidence that she should forgive what he did. The two questions were not the same. Naomi returned to Atlanta 6 weeks after the surgery, moving slowly through the airport while her mother carried the bag she normally would have refused to surrender. She hated needing help, then hated herself for hating it, because dependence had begun to feel dangerously similar to losing control. Denise never argued with that fear. She simply asked before helping, even when the answers seemed obvious. That small habit became one of the ways Naomi relearned that care could exist without taking possession of a decision. At home, recovery was less cinematic than people imagined when they heard the story. There were medical appointments, insurance calls, restless nights, sudden fatigue, and mornings when the scar hurt before Naomi had fully opened her eyes. There were also afternoons when she felt almost normal, which frightened her differently because normality could disappear without warning. She stopped looking at the scar in the mirror for nearly a month. When she finally did, she expected rage. Instead, she felt grief for the version of herself who had entered that dinner believing love made the person across the table safe. Naomi did not blame that woman for trusting her husband. Learning that distinction took longer than learning how to walk without guarding one side of her body. Her therapist asked whether she wanted to describe the surgery as something Min-jae had done to her, or something she had survived. Naomi said both descriptions were true, but she refused to let the second erase the first. Survival was not permission to make the crime inspirational before she was ready. For months, she kept a glass of water beside her bed and still checked whether she remembered pouring it herself. She avoided restaurants with dim lighting because the dinner house outside Seoul returned too quickly in darkness. She startled when men reached across her unexpectedly. Even when they were only moving a chair, her body had learned suspicion faster than her mind could reason with it. Elena visited from Mexico and never once told Naomi she needed to move on. Instead, she brought spreadsheets from the investigation and asked whether Naomi wanted to work or watch terrible television. Some days Naomi chose the spreadsheets. Other days she chose the television and considered that decision equally productive. 1 month after returning home, Naomi tried to attend a routine medical appointment alone because independence had become something she measured obsessively. She made it through the lobby, signed the forms, and froze when a nurse asked whether someone could accompany her for a scan. The request was ordinary, but the word accompany dragged her back to the night Min-jae had decided where her body would go. Naomi left the building before the appointment began and sat in her car until the shaking stopped. For 20 minutes, she hated herself for leaving. Then she called the clinic, explained that she needed the visit rescheduled with a patient advocate present, and asked for every procedure in writing beforehand. The receptionist agreed without argument. That simple response showed Naomi how abnormal the Kang family's world had been, where every boundary had been treated as an obstacle to overcome. At the rescheduled appointment, Naomi brought Denise and asked every question she wanted before allowing anyone to touch her. Nothing dramatic happened. That ordinary consent became more healing than any speech about courage. Her physician explained that people can live with one healthy kidney, but Naomi would need long-term medical follow-up because the removal had not been voluntary or properly planned. The doctor also reminded her that recovery was not a straight line, and that fear around medical settings was understandable after what she had experienced. Naomi appreciated the absence of false reassurance. She did not need anyone promising everything would be exactly as before. Exactly as before was impossible. What she needed was enough truth to make her own decisions about what came next. At home, Denise began labeling leftovers with dates because Naomi's father had once hidden financial problems inside ordinary household routines. The habit had nothing to do with medicine, yet Naomi found comfort in information being visible rather than concealed for her supposed protection. She started doing the same with documents, appointments, passwords, and every decision involving her care. Control was not the same as safety, but transparency helped her recognize the difference. Meanwhile, Min-jae entered custody before trial after prosecutors argued that his family connections made private release too risky. The first night in detention, he asked his attorney whether Naomi was medically stable. The attorney said Rebecca had made it clear that Naomi's health was no longer information Min-jae had any right to receive. For several seconds, Min-jae looked offended by the boundary, before understanding the obscenity of that reaction. He had once known Naomi's blood type before she did. Now, he was not entitled to know whether she had slept through the night. That loss of access became one of the first consequences he could not negotiate around. Sua visited him after she was strong enough to travel. She sat across the glass and asked whether he had personally handed Naomi the drink that made her lose consciousness. Min-jae said yes. Sua asked whether Naomi had looked at him while she realized what was happening. He said yes again. Sua closed her eyes and told him she wished he had lied, because the truth meant he had watched trust disappear from Naomi's face in real time. Min-jae said that image was the reason he could no longer use their father's pressure as the center of his explanation. Sua replied that pressure belonged in the story, but it did not belong in the place where responsibility should have been. Before leaving, she told him something harder than anger. She said the kidney inside her body would always connect them to Naomi. But that connection gave neither sibling any claim on Naomi's future. Min-jae understood that even remorse could become another form of entitlement if he expected Naomi to witness it. After that visit, he stopped asking attorneys for updates about her unless the information was part of a public court filing. Naomi never knew he made that change. That was appropriate, because growth performed for the person harmed would still make her responsible for evaluating it. The criminal cases moved forward in Korea, while Naomi recovered in the United States. Dr. Park's records showed that the hidden surgical suite had been used repeatedly for procedures that could not survive ordinary regulatory scrutiny. Several former Meridian workers came forward after Liza Mercado's testimony became protected evidence. Not every case involved a stolen organ, and Naomi insisted investigators separate provable crimes from suspicious patterns. That discipline frustrated people who wanted the largest possible scandal. Naomi wanted a case strong enough to survive powerful defense attorneys. Mateo Serrano's widow eventually agreed to testify that her husband had never understood the procedure that preceded his death. She had accepted money afterward because she was afraid, undocumented at the time, and caring for 2 children alone. Naomi refused to let reporters describe that payment as proof the widow had willingly participated in silence. Fear could produce a signature without producing freedom. The same principle applied to the documents Dr. Park had fabricated under Naomi's name. A signature was not consent merely because someone powerful needed it to look like consent. Sue-ah remained in Seoul, recovering physically while struggling with a guilt nobody knew how to solve cleanly. The stolen kidney continued functioning, which made every good medical report emotionally complicated. She asked her doctors whether removing it would somehow restore justice. They told her another major operation would not return Naomi's kidney to its original body and could endanger her own life. Sue-ah accepted the medical reality without accepting what her father had done. She testified before prosecutors for 7 hours across 2 days. She described the family pressure, the lies about the donor, and the moment she learned Naomi had been the person on the other side of her survival. When lawyers asked whether she wanted the transplant reversed, Sue-ah said she wanted the crime to have never happened. Since that was impossible, she wanted the people responsible to stop deciding what everyone else should sacrifice. Months passed before Naomi agreed to speak with Sue-ah again. The first conversation happened by video. With Rebecca present and no expectation of emotional resolution, Sue-ah looked healthier than Naomi remembered, which caused a flash of resentment so sharp Naomi almost ended the call. She stayed because leaving should be her choice, not an automatic reaction to pain. Sue-ah said she understood if Naomi never wanted a relationship with her again. Naomi replied that Sue-ah had not stolen the kidney, but she was still living with something taken from Naomi without permission. Both facts would always be present between them. Sue-ah nodded and did not ask Naomi to make the contradiction easier. That restraint became the beginning of a different kind of relationship, slower and more careful than friendship had once been. They spoke rarely at first. Sometimes Sue-ah sent a cello recording without commentary, and Naomi listened only when she wanted to. Sometimes Naomi replied with a photograph of Atlanta rain or her mother's garden. Nothing more intimate than that. Neither woman pretended the connection was uncomplicated. The court proceedings against Min-jae began almost a year after the surgery. He pleaded guilty to charges connected to unlawful restraint, conspiracy, medical coercion, and his role in transporting Naomi while she was unconscious. His cooperation against Dae-sung and Dr. Park reduced the sentence prosecutors sought, but it did not eliminate prison. At sentencing, Min-jae did not describe himself as another victim of his father. He said pressure explained why he was afraid, but it did not explain away what he chose to do with that fear. He acknowledged that he had turned Naomi's trust into access. He acknowledged that he had treated one person's life as more valuable because that person was his sister. He acknowledged that love had not prevented the crime, because his version of love still believed he could decide what Naomi should endure. Naomi watched the hearing remotely from Rebecca's office. She did not cry when Min-jae spoke. She cried when the prosecutor displayed the photograph of the dining table where the last voluntary evening of her marriage had ended. 2 plates remained in the image, 1 chair pushed back, and a half-finished glass near Naomi's place. The ordinary appearance of the room made the betrayal feel fresh again. The judge sentenced Min-jae to a substantial term in prison, followed by years of supervised release and restrictions on corporate control. He also forfeited assets into a compensation fund administered without Kang family authority. Dae-sung's trial lasted longer. He denied ordering Naomi's kidnapping and claimed Min-jae had acted independently because he was emotionally unstable over Sue-ah's condition. Financial records contradicted him, security logs contradicted him. Dr. Park's messages contradicted him. Most damagingly, Sua contradicted him from the witness stand. She told the court her father had spent years describing sacrifice as love whenever someone else was expected to sacrifice. Then she said survival bought with another person's stolen body was not family devotion. It was ownership disguised as love. Dae-sung was convicted on multiple charges and received a sentence that effectively ended his control of the Kang organization. Dr. Park lost his medical license permanently and was convicted for his role in the illegal procedures and falsified records. The rehabilitation property was seized. The underground room was photographed, measured, catalogued, and eventually sealed as evidence before the property was transferred out of Kang control. Naomi refused to visit it. She had no interest in proving courage by standing in the place where she had been powerless. Her refusal became another act of choice. Public attention changed once the convictions became impossible to dismiss as a marital dispute. Naomi agreed to one long-form interview only after the cases involving other victims were protected. She rejected the host's first description of her as a woman who had been fooled by a mafia prince. She said trusting a spouse was not stupidity. The wrongdoing belonged to the person who weaponized that trust. The interview became widely shared because Naomi refused the simple story people expected. She said Min-jae had loved her in ways that felt real. She also said he had committed an unforgivable violation against her body. The two truths did not cancel each other. If anything, their coexistence explained why betrayal could hurt more when it came from genuine attachment rather than pure deception. Naomi's career changed after the case, but not in the direction her old firm expected. Several corporations offered senior compliance positions with enormous salaries and carefully worded promises about personal security. She declined them. Instead, she founded Clear Ledger Initiative with Elena and two former prosecutors who had worked on medical financial crime cases. The organization focused on financial fraud, patient consent systems, trafficking risks, and the hidden business structures that allowed vulnerable people to disappear inside legitimate companies. Naomi insisted the work never turned survivors into marketing material. Clients could pay for expertise, not access to someone's trauma. The first major contract came from a hospital network trying to redesign donor consent auditing after reviewing the Kang case. Naomi required independent patient advocates to be part of the system rather than relying on signatures collected by the same institutions benefiting from treatment. She had learned painfully that consent was not a box checked once. It was the continuing right to understand, refuse, change one's mind, and walk away. 2 years after the surgery, Naomi bought the small Atlanta house she had once described to Min-jae during the rooftop rain in Mexico City. The kitchen was wide enough for Denise, the backyard received too much sun, and the plumbing made noises that annoyed Elena whenever she visited. Naomi loved it immediately. Signing the mortgage should have been an ordinary moment. Instead, she paused when the agent handed her a silver-colored pen. For half a second, her mind returned to Min-jae's fountain pen and the marriage license she had signed while believing the future belonged equally to them. Naomi handed the pen back and used her own black one. Nobody else understood why that mattered. She did not need them to. Min-jae wrote his first letter from prison 6 months after sentencing. He did not ask Naomi to answer. He wrote that he had spent years believing responsibility meant protecting people from consequences, when often it meant allowing them to choose consequences for themselves. Naomi read the letter once, and placed it in a locked drawer. The second letter arrived almost a year later. Min-jae wrote that Sua had visited and told him the kidney continued functioning well. He said hearing that news made him grateful and ashamed at the same time. Naomi stopped reading there and put the letter away. His gratitude was not something she was ready to carry. The third letter contained no update about Sua. It contained one sentence Naomi returned to several times. "I believe I loved you, and I understand now that believing that does not make what I did less violent." Naomi did not answer for another year. When she finally wrote back, she used only 4 sentences. She told him she believed he had loved her. She told him that was precisely why the betrayal had destroyed something deeper than trust in one man. She told him love was not innocence. Then she told him she did not want further letters. Min-jae obeyed. No letter arrived the following month, or the month after that, or the year after that. The absence hurt once, which surprised Naomi. Then it became peaceful. 4 years after the surgery, Clear Ledger invited Naomi to Seoul for a conference on cross-border medical exploitation. She accepted because refusing to return would have allowed the city to remain owned by her worst memory. Naomi stayed in a hotel, she selected herself, traveled without Kang's security, and walked through neighborhoods she had once known only from the back seat of protected cars. On the final evening, Soo-ah joined her for dinner. She wore blue, as she always had, and moved with more strength than Naomi remembered. For the first time, seeing Soo-ah healthy did not immediately feel like seeing proof of theft. It still hurt, but the hurt had changed shape. Soo-ah thanked Naomi for agreeing to see her. Naomi said gratitude was complicated when neither of them had chosen the transaction connecting their bodies. Soo-ah agreed. She did not apologize again. That restraint was one reason Naomi could remain at the table. After dinner, Soo-ah gave Naomi a small envelope. Inside was the silver fountain pen Min-jae had carried for years. Soo-ah said he had sent it through his attorney after Naomi asked him never to write again. There was no note. Naomi held the pen and remembered the warehouse, the marriage license, the dinner house, and the man who had confused love with permission. She could have thrown it away. She could have returned it. Instead, Naomi carried it back to Atlanta and placed it in a box with the court documents she no longer needed to read. The object did not deserve a dramatic ending any more than Min-jae did. It was evidence of a life she had survived, not a symbol that still controlled her. Months later, Naomi spoke at a university about financial systems that hide medical exploitation. A student asked whether she regretted loving Min-jae. Naomi considered the question before answering. She said regretting love would mean blaming herself for the part of the story that had been honest on her side. She regretted what he chose to do with that love. She regretted that he believed his fear gave him the right to spend something that belonged only to her. But she did not regret having been capable of trust. The room became quiet. Naomi told the students that betrayal should teach people where boundaries matter, not convince them that trust itself is foolish. After the talk, she returned home and found Denise cooking in the wide kitchen she had once imagined years earlier. Rain touched the windows softly. Naomi poured her own glass of water, carried it to the table, and drank without checking it twice. The action was so ordinary, nobody else noticed. Naomi did. Her life had not returned to what it was before Min-jae. One kidney was gone, the scar remained, and some forms of trust would always require more time than they once had. But the body he had treated like a family resource was still hers. The future he had tried to decide was still hers. And the love he had used as an argument for forgiveness no longer had authority over either one. Naomi had not won by pretending the betrayal never happened. She had won by refusing to let the worst thing done in the name of love become the final definition of her life.